The question slipped out of my son's mouth while he was stacking his Lego towers on the living room rug, and I was half listening, half scrolling through an email from work. His voice bright and ordinary when he asked why Daddy always ate lunch with Aunt Lisa instead of coming home, and the air in the room shifted, heavy in a way that pressed on my chest because Lisa wasn't really his aunt. She was my husband's coworker, someone I'd seen at a few holiday parties. Someone who wore crisp blouses tucked neatly into pencil skirts and laughed with a hand brushing against my husband's arm like she had a right to, and I had dismissed it. Told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself marriages survive because you learn to ignore small sparks before they become fires, but hearing my little boy say it, so casually, so unburdened, made the sparks flare into something else, something I couldn't shove down. Because how many lunches had there been? How many times had my husband chosen her instead of the sandwich I left wrapped in foil for him on the kitchen counter, the one that always came back untouched? The foil crinkled as if he had opened it and then forgotten, or maybe pretended to forget. And suddenly the image of those sandwiches stacked in the fridge felt like relics of my own foolishness, my devotion trapped in plastic containers he never carried. And I asked my son what he meant, my voice thin, my smile practiced. And he shrugged in that absent-minded way children do when they're telling the truth without knowing its weight, said Daddy always meets Aunt Lisa by the park cafe, they eat there. He's seen them when Grandma picks him up sometimes, and I nodded, heart pounding against my ribs because it wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a child's testimony, unpolished and pure, and it left me no place to hide. So when my husband came home that evening smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual one, a sharper scent clinging to his shirt, I asked how his day went, and he said the usual. Paperwork, meetings, the kind of words that form walls between people, and I wanted to scream. To throw the foil-wrapped sandwiches in his face, but I sat there with him at the dinner table, my son chattering about Legos and superheroes, and watched my husband chew slowly, carefully, as if even his bites were calculated. And in that moment I knew the truth lived just beneath his skin, waiting for me to peel it back layer by layer. And the question was whether I had the strength to look. That night after everyone was asleep I lay in bed listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me, too even, too rehearsed, like he was performing the role of a man at rest. And my mind wouldn't stop replaying my son's words, circling them until they lodged like splinters under my skin. Aunt Lisa, Aunt Lisa. A name that suddenly sounded wrong in my own house, like an echo from a place I wasn't invited to, and I reached for his phone on the nightstand, fingers trembling, telling myself I wouldn't actually do it, that I still had dignity. But the screen lit up and betrayed me before I even touched it. A preview of a message glowing faintly, tomorrow, same spot, can't wait. And I dropped the phone back as though it had burned me, lying there in the dark with the truth buzzing in my veins. And I thought of every lunch I had spent alone, every time he'd brushed off coming home because he was swamped, and how those excuses had piled up into a wall I'd let myself believe was real. And the next day I packed my son into the car under the pretense of getting ice cream, drove past the park cafe he had mentioned, my stomach twisting, and there they were, in plain sight, my husband and Lisa sitting close, shoulders nearly touching across a small metal table, laughing in that way people do when they forget the world is watching. And I sat there at the curb gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, my son licking chocolate off his fingers in the backseat, innocent, unbothered. while I stared at the man I thought I knew breaking our life in broad daylight. And I wanted to march over, to drag him home by his collar, but something in me froze. A part that wanted to collect evidence, to be sure. To not let him gaslight me with half-truths, so I drove away with the image seared into me. And that night when he walked through the door whistling softly as though nothing had happened, placing his keys in the same dish by the entryway like always, I almost admired the performance, the audacity of it. And when he kissed our son's forehead goodnight and slid into bed beside me, I wondered how long I could play along. How long before the truth erupted out of me like broken glass cutting everything in its path. The days that followed felt like walking barefoot across shards. Every routine moment carrying hidden edges, his good morning kiss tasting of lies. His lunchbox left untouched on the counter like an artifact of neglect. And I kept rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining the calm way I would confront him. The questions I would ask, but when the evenings came I swallowed them back down. Afraid of what would spill out, so instead I began to watch him more closely. The tilt of his head when he checked his phone. The way his eyes darted toward the garage before answering a call. And each detail layered into a picture I didn't want but couldn't ignore. And then one afternoon while folding laundry in the bedroom I heard my son in the kitchen, chattering into the family iPad we sometimes let him use. And curiosity pulled me forward until I saw Lisa's face glowing on the screen, her smile soft, her voice syrupy as she said hello to him like they were family. Like she had a place in his childhood. And my stomach lurched because this wasn't a secret affair hidden in shadows. She was already seeping into our home through my child's trust, and I snapped the iPad shut. My son looking up at me startled, asking why I was mad, and I forced a smile, said nothing. But later that night I scrolled through the call history and saw her name appear again and again, not hidden, not disguised, just bold and ordinary, as if she had earned that space. And the fury that welled up inside me finally broke my paralysis. So the next day I drove back to that cafe without telling anyone, parked across the street. Waited until I saw them arrive, my husband holding the door for her, her hand brushing his back like it belonged there, and I snapped photos with trembling fingers. Evidence I hated myself for needing. And as I sat there with the proof glowing on my phone I realized I wasn't afraid of being called crazy anymore. The story was writing itself in front of me. And soon I would have to decide how to read it aloud. Whether to confront him with screams and tears or something colder, sharper. The kind of silence that makes a man crumble because it tells him you've already seen the end. The photos stayed buried in my phone like loaded bullets. Each glance at them setting my pulse racing. And I started to notice the tiniest cracks in his stories. How he'd mention grabbing a quick bite at his desk yet his shirt carried the faint scent of grilled onions from the cafe menu. How he'd claim a client meeting ran long though the timestamp on Lisa's call aligned perfectly with that gap, and I carried those contradictions in my chest like live wires, sparking every time he smiled too easily. Every time he brushed past me with a kiss that no longer landed. And meanwhile my son grew more comfortable saying her name. Recounting small details like how Aunt Lisa always gave him extra fries. How she remembered his favorite juice box. And I had to swallow my rage while pretending not to choke on it. Because to him it was harmless, it was kindness, and to me it was an invasion. A trespass into the sacred circle of mother and child. And the final fracture came one Friday when he claimed he was stuck in traffic and would be late for dinner, and I felt something harden in me. So I bundled our son into the car and drove to the office lot, only to find it nearly empty. The dusk light washing over rows of abandoned cars, and then I saw it. His truck parked not at the office but 2 blocks down outside a small motel. Neon sign flickering, curtains drawn tight in a room whose number I memorized without meaning. 2, and I sat there trembling while my son hummed in the backseat, blissfully unaware. And when my husband finally came home hours later smelling faintly of cheap soap that didn't belong to our house, he kissed my cheek too quickly, eyes darting away. And I knew the time for silent gathering of evidence had passed. That the truth was already crawling under the doors and through the cracks, pressing against me until I either released it or suffocated. And as I lay awake that night listening to him breathe with the steadiness of a lyre, I planned the moment I would let the truth drop like a hammer. Not because I wanted his confession, but because I wanted him to feel the floor vanish beneath his feet the way it had under mine. The next morning I didn't speak to him over coffee. Just stirred my spoon in silence and watched him scroll his phone with the composure of someone convinced the play was still convincing. And when he left for a client breakfast, I packed my son's backpack and dropped him at my mother's, telling her only that we needed a night apart. And then I drove straight back to that motel, my hands slick on the steering wheel, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. And I parked across the street until I saw him again, stepping out with Lisa beside him. Her hair loose, her laugh unguarded, and their shoulders touched in that careless way of people who believe they are safe. And for a second I thought I might storm across, scream until the world tilted. But instead I stayed still, taking in the sight, letting it carve deep. Because I wanted him to wonder later how long I had known, how close I had been. And I followed them at a distance. Watched them slip into a diner like it was any normal Saturday. Watched him order pancakes as though he hadn't just dismantled our marriage behind closed doors, and the ordinariness of it nearly made me sick, how betrayal could look so mundane. 2 people sharing coffee while the woman at home stitches the fabric of family tighter every day, unaware she's been erased from the pattern. And when I finally returned home I didn't cry, didn't rage, just sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the photos, lining them up like puzzle pieces of a story I could no longer pretend wasn't mine. And that night when he came through the door carrying groceries like a peace offering, humming some tune under his breath, I studied him with a new detachment. Like he was already someone else, and when he asked what was for dinner I smiled too sweetly. Told him leftovers, and the way his eyes flickered with slight unease told me he felt it. The shift, the quiet that held more power than shouting ever could. Because I had stopped clinging to the version of him I once believed in. And now every movement was me pulling the strings, waiting for the moment I would cut them. I began rehearsing the confrontation in my mind like a play I didn't want to perform. The lines spilling out while I folded laundry, while I brushed my teeth, while I stood at the sink watching suds slide down plates he never washed. And every version ended differently. Sometimes I screamed until my throat tore. Sometimes I laughed in his face. Sometimes I said nothing at all and let the silence crush him, but the truth was I still didn't know which mask I would wear, only that the stage was set. And then one evening after our son was asleep, I laid the photos on the kitchen table one by one, lined them like evidence in a courtroom. And when he walked in and saw them his face flickered, just for a second. Before he smoothed it into something practiced, something he thought was control. And he reached for the papers with trembling fingers, asked me what this was supposed to mean. And I didn't raise my voice, just told him to stop insulting me. Told him our son already knew more than he realized, and that was when his jaw tightened. His mask cracked, and he tried to spin the story, said Lisa was lonely. Said she needed company, said it was innocent, and I laughed, the sound sharp, ugly. Not my own, because innocence doesn't check into motels or whisper promises over pancakes. And his shoulders sagged like he knew the game was up. But then he looked at me with a strange defiance, as if daring me to decide what happened next. And in that pause I realized this was no longer about uncovering lies. It was about reclaiming my own footing. About making him feel the freefall I had lived in since the moment our son spoke her name. And so I told him simply that his things would be packed by morning. That he could decide whether to face his son with the truth or vanish into the arms of the woman who had already been woven into our days, and I left him sitting there in the kitchen, surrounded by the photos, by the wreckage of his performance. And for the first time in weeks I felt my chest expand, air rushing in clean and sharp. Because the script was no longer his to control, it was mine. He didn't leave that night, just sat at the table long after I went to bed. The glow of his phone flickering under the crack of the door. And by morning his clothes were still hanging in the closet. His shoes still lined neatly by the door, but something in the house had shifted. An absence inside the presence, and when our son padded into the kitchen asking if Daddy was taking him to school, I said not today. My voice steady though my hands trembled pouring cereal. And later I watched from the window as he finally carried a duffel bag out to the truck. Lisa's car idling at the curb like she'd been waiting all along. And I felt a strange mix of grief and release. Like stitches tearing open so the wound could finally breathe. And in the weeks that followed he tried to call, sometimes to argue, sometimes to plead. But I answered rarely, because what was left to salvage when trust had been bled dry? And the house began to feel like mine again, the silence different now. Not suffocating but clean, and I started to notice my son's resilience. How quickly children adapt, how he stopped saying Aunt Lisa and went back to talking about superheroes and spelling tests, though sometimes his eyes searched mine for answers I wasn't ready to give, and I would hold him tighter, whispering promises that even broken homes can be safe. And one afternoon months later I found an old foil-wrapped sandwich at the back of the freezer, hard as stone, and I stood there holding it, remembering all the meals that came back untouched, the lies tucked between slices of bread. And I tossed it into the trash without ceremony, a small ritual of letting go. And that night when my son asked if Daddy would be home soon, I told him no, not here. Not like before, but that we were still a family, just smaller, just different. And he nodded with the quiet acceptance only children carry. And I realized the betrayal would always be a scar, but it wouldn't be the whole story. Because the ending wasn't about him leaving, it was about me choosing to stay, with myself. With my child, with the truth that finally had room to breathe.